morning, folks. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome back. Right, for day 2 of our Irish themed Peace and Reconciliation Conference. Again, I'm Bob Hendershot, and we're very excited to be continuing our series of excellent speakers and events today. To kick us off this morning, we have Professor Jim Smith of the University of Notre Dame, the Irish Studies Institute there. Professor Smith took his BA at Trinity College Dublin and his PhD from the University of Cambridge. Before coming to Notre Dame, he taught at Oxford and Cambridge universities. He has written extensively on 17th and 18th century Ireland and is the author of Men of No Property, Irish Radicals and Popular Politics in the Late 18th Century. He's the editor of a collection of essays, Revolution, Counter-Revolution, and Union, Ireland in the 1790s, and also the author of Making the United Kingdom, 1660 to 1800, Religion, Identity, and the State in Britain and Ireland. He's also currently working on a book on the intellectual traditions, or the intellectual patterns unfolding in Britain in the 1950s, which sounds extremely interesting as well. But anyway, please welcome to the podium Professor Jim Smith, University of Notre Dame.
Thank you. We're going to need to get this cleared, the screen cleared.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, very simple. Thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to be here. Now, I've stepped in at short notice for Tony Johnson, and he said to me on Saturday that he was going to give a lecture on the historical roots of the conflict in the north of Ireland, specifically the 17th century. Now, why the 17th century? Why not the 16th century or the 19th century for that matter? And I'll come back to that in a moment. It's a highly rational decision that he made to talk about the 17th century, which I will talk about this morning. And I discussed somewhat why, particularly that century. Now, I'm going to start with a rather hoary old joke. I'd be embarrassed telling this joke in Ireland, but I can get away with it in Michigan. Although it's probably been doing the rounds that long that I might not even be able to get away with it here. And 2 quotations about the burden of history, really, in the Irish situation. Now, the plane was coming into Aldergrove, Belfast International Airport, and the pilot's voice came over the tannoy, and it said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we're now approaching Belfast International Airport. Please set back your watches 400 years." And, now, note the 400, not the 5 or 3. Now, this is a quotation from a magnificent book by historian Oliver MacDonagh, States of Mind, and he opens, this is his opening chapter, this is the opening paragraph of the first chapter. After Lord George's first meeting with De Valera on the 14th of July, 1921, to negotiate a peace treaty between Great Britain and Ireland, he told the secretary, this is Lord George, "I made no impression. I listened to a long lecture on the wrong done to Ireland by Cromwell. And whenever I tried to bring him, De Valera, back to the present day, back he went to Cromwell again." The trouble, as Lord George was saying, in effect, was that while the English do not remember any history, the Irish forget none. Behind this familiar facetiousness lies a profound truth. To Lloyd George, the 17th century was dead, irrelevant to current difficulties, except perhaps in helping to explain how these difficulties might remotely have come into being. To De Valera, the 17th century lived on, in that it generated still unexpiated and irredeemed injustices. The mere intervention of years, however many, could do nothing whatever to change the ethical reality. And thirdly, a quotation from Winston Churchill from the following year, 1922, and it's reflecting on the impact of the Great War, as it was then called, what we now call the First World War. This is Churchill. Then came the Great War. Every institution almost in the world was strained. Great empires had been overturned. The whole map of Europe had been changed. The position of countries had been violently altered. The modes of thought of men, the whole outlook on affairs, the grouping of parties, all had encountered violent and tremendous change in the deluge of the world. But as the deluge subsides and the waters fall short, we see the dreary steeples of Fermanagh and Tyrone emerging once again. The integrity of their quarrel is one of the few institutions that has been unaltered in the cataclysm which has swept the world. In Ireland, nothing changes. Now, I just want to make clear at the outset what I'm not going to argue. I do not argue that history is destiny. In other words, that the Irish or any other people are locked into conflict by their history. I'm not determinist in that way, which is what Churchill seems to be suggesting here in his very eloquent way. Nor am I suggesting that the Irish are uniquely historically literate. You know, that they're uniquely aware of their history, which sometimes people imagine. I'm not suggesting that, you know, when someone in, let's say, 1985 planted a car bomb in London, or someone was a member of a loyalist paramilitary death squad, that they were doing this because of the Battle of the Boyne or 1916. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if they couldn't give you the date of the Battle of the Boyne. This is one of the great fallacies of the revisionist project in Irish history. This notion that if you get rid of this popular mythology, if you get rid of this nationalistic history and tell people things how it really was, how complicated it was, how there were 4 and 5 sides to the question, that once people understand this, well then they won't take such a simple-minded attitude to politics, and young men won't join up to die for the cause. So if you get history right, you get politics right, and you get the society right. I think that's a very simple-minded, even nonsensical view of how history operates in a society. And thirdly, I'm not arguing that we should draw the lessons of history. Now, history does have lessons, but the trick, and it's a very difficult one, is to draw the right lessons. History is extremely dangerous politically because it's very easy to draw the wrong lessons. I mean, there's a great example of this actually in the 20th century, and that is the Suez fiasco in 1956. And the British and the French and the Israelis went into Suez Canal in Egypt against Nasser. Now, history was partly to blame for this, because once Nasser nationalised the Suez Canal, the British Prime Minister Anthony Eden, who had been Foreign Secretary in the 1930s, had resigned before Munich, he said, "This is aggression, this is an authoritarian ruler, you can't appease these people. We appeased these people in 1938, and look what happened, we got World War II. We cannot appease it." It was completely the wrong lesson to draw. Right? And it was a fiasco. And Nasser was not Hitler, and so on. The way in which the Vietnam analogy was used in Iraq, you know, people, if you remember, in 2003, what was the word that was being most often used? Quagmire. We're not going to get drawn into a Vietnam-style quagmire. The analogy that they should have been looking at, in my opinion, was the British in Mesopotamia, Iraq, in the 1920s. And if anyone had taken care to look at the British in Iraq in the 1920s, no one would have been talking about flowers being strewn on the streets of Baghdad. It wasn't going to happen. And what happened in that aberration resulted in part from a profound ignorance of Mesopotamian or Iraqi history. So what I'm saying is, yes, you can draw lessons from history, but you have to be very careful indeed which lessons you do draw. What history can do for us is it can help explain the present, and what it does do is that it transmits conditions to the present. You cannot understand the situation in the north of Ireland unless you understand their historical background. And this brings me back to the 400 years and putting back your watch 400 years and why the 17th century. What that joke is referring to is, of course, the Ulster Plantation. And we cannot, everything in the north flows from the plantation. Now, what was this plantation? Well, just to illustrate, as it were, the contemporary significance. Oh, that was me. This is South Armagh in the 1990s. There's a British Army post and a British Army helicopter bringing in supplies. Now, the reason it's a helicopter is because really by about the 1970s, the British Army had given up travelling by surface in South Armagh because it was simply too dangerous. Because their armoured cars were being blown up on the roads in South Armagh. And it was the only part in the north of Ireland where this was the case, where they basically travelled all the time by helicopter. And they had a nickname for South Armagh. And that nickname was Bandit Country. Right? This was the British Army description of South Armagh. If you look at this map of the plantation, and the various categories of, that man there would probably recognise this picture here. They were talking about South Armagh, he just made it. Yeah. Now, there are various categories of planter, which I will explain, but the point was that there were certain areas which were left to the Irish, which were given to what were called the deserving Irish. That is, those Irish who had fought against O'Neill and had fought on the side of the English crown. And there were certain areas which were more or less left untouched by the plantation. And often this was for sound economic reasons. In other words, a lot of the poor land, the deserving Irish got the worst land. It's a simple equation. Now, if you look at this, if you just leave the helicopter out of it and leave the military post out of it, you look at the quality of the land there, right? That sort of land was deemed to be left to the native Irish. Right? And often there was a rough rule of thumb, which was above 600 feet. And there's no saying in the north of Ireland that the Protestants got the good land, but the Catholics got the view. So places like around Dungiven where they're up the hills. Now, South Armagh was more or less left unplanted as a result of the plantation. Because the land was poor. So what you had there was an area which remained Catholic, which remained in ethnic terms Irish and Irish speaking. So just fast read forward, Restoration Ireland, the 1670s, 1680s, there were bands of banditti called rapparees, right? People who were harassing the planters, and who were basically living off the country as bandits. The most famous of all rapparees was a man called Redmond O'Hanlon. Where was his base? South Armagh. 1790s, my period, there was an agrarian organisation called the Defenders, which was Catholic, which ended up merging with the United Irishmen, Republican, inspired by what was going on in France, also very sectarian. One of the most notorious atrocities of the 1790s was the mutilation of a Protestant school teacher, a man called Alexander Barclay, in Fork Hill in South Armagh by the Defenders. So this place is trouble in the 1670s, it's trouble in the 1790s, and as you can see here, it's trouble in the 1970s, 80s and 90s. You can't understand that, you can't explain that, by the fact that, people call Carragher are unusually violent. It's a structural thing. It's based in the structure of the plantation. And so it is with Derry, stroke Londonderry. That foci of conflict is also based on in the plantation. Now, you all know about, in this map, for instance, it's called Londonderry, right? Natives of the city call it Derry. It's called Londonderry because one of the category of planter was the London Company. This was a group of merchants. This was an enterprise. This was an investment, and they were given this area. It was called Coleraine, in fact, which included the city of Derry, and that's where it gets the London from. Yeah? This, of course, is something that Catholics and nationalists have never accepted. Now, as I said to you about the way in which the land was distributed, I was travelling one time, driving from Larne across Antrim, Derry, up to the city of Derry, and you can tell which areas had been planted in the 17th century and which had not by the quality of the land. So when you come around Dungiven, you go up into the Glenshane Pass, this is Catholic territory. But there are other telltale signs, right? And as we were coming through, when we were going through a Protestant area or a Unionist area, the signpost said, Londonderry, 26 mile. And you go perhaps 10 mile along the road, again around, say, Dungiven, and it will say Derry. So people had painted out the London. Right? So you knew which kind of area you were in, and you could tell, if you were a historian, you could tell the pattern of the plantation from these road signs, right? And the ones where London had been painted out. But I always remember we were driving through one area and someone had painted out Derry, right? So it said London, 35 mile. And I laughed and I thought, my God, imagine you're a Japanese tourist. Imagine the panic that tourists would experience, and I'm sure it's happened. The Japanese, for example, there's always Japanese tourists making pilgrimages to Seamus Heaney's farm. So you can imagine these tourists going, oh God, we're on the wrong island. Now, the plantation came about as a result of the defeat of Hugh O'Neill. A rather formidable looking character, don't you think? And O'Neill this was the last basically act of resistance from Gaelic Ireland against the processes of Anglicisation. It was the last and the greatest act of resistance, and O'Neill was defeated and surrendered at Mellifont. This is the surrender of O'Neill in 1803. Now, he was pardoned, which wasn't unusual in this era, and returned to his lands in what is now Tyrone, in mid-Ulster. But his position was made untenable by the Lord Deputy, a man called Chichester. There were various legal cases were taken against O'Neill by lesser tenants and people who had been subordinate to O'Neill, and they were getting the favour of the crown. And so he was the great O'Neill. He had been the most powerful chieftain in Ireland. He had been something approximating to an ardri, a high king. And he was being humiliated in the post-war settlement. And his position was being whittled away. And eventually this led him to basically get out. This is the so-called flight of the Earls, O'Neill, O'Donnell, the O'Rourkes, and a host of other Gaelic lords in the north. Left the country, I think it was in September 1607, and made their way to Catholic Europe, continental Europe, in the hope of staging a return which never happened. Now, this act, this flight, was illegal in English law. What in fact they had done in a legal sense, in a technical sense, was they had gone into rebellion and put themselves outside the king's peace. So they were technically, this is a legal category now, rebels by going into flight. What this meant was that their land escheated, reverted to the crown. In law, all land belonged to the crown. Okay, so once these people put themselves in rebellion, that land reverted to the crown. So O'Neill and these lords who had fled, this vast tracts of land were opened up for crown use. And they took the decision to plant that land. So this is why Ulster, which had been the most Gaelic of the four provinces, which had shown the most resistance to the English crown, is transformed into the place which is the most British, the most Protestant, and so on. It's a consequence of the plantation. The plantation, the planters, they say there were a number of categories. Whoops. But there were two ethnic groups, were Scots and English. Then you say the Londonderry category, which was the London companies, which were merchants. Then you had certain institutional grantees. Trinity College Dublin was given land as part of its financial base. Trinity College Dublin to this day owns farmland in County Fermanagh. The Church of Ireland and the Viceroy or the Lord Lieutenant Chichester, who Chichester was given in a Sean, right? This peninsula here in North Donegal. So these were the various beneficiaries, and there were categories. There were undertakers, that is people who undertook to plant this land. There were servitors, that is soldiers who had fought in the wars. This was their payment for fighting in the wars. And then there were the deserving Irish, that is the Irish who had cooperated with the Crown forces in the war. Now, plantation, of course, meant that a number of the native Irish were expelled from their lands. But many were retained basically as tenants on their land. Now, a number of these expelled Irish resisted the plantation, and they were known as wood-kern, who are an early example of the Rapparees, who I mentioned, or the defenders. This is a long tradition in Irish society. Many other people just got on with it. And there was intermarriage, and you have examples, particularly of Scots, lowland Scots, learning Gaelic, taking on Gaelic culture, and so forth. Now, for reasons which are very complex indeed, I mean, we still don't fully understand what happened in this crisis of the late 1630s. It was a kind of billiard ball effect between the three kingdoms, Scotland, Ireland, and England, which led to the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. What used to be called the English Civil War is now called the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, because you had Irishmen fighting in Scotland, you had Scots fighting in Ireland, you had Scots fighting in England, you had Irishmen fighting in England, you had Englishmen fighting in Ireland, you had Englishmen fighting in Scotland, and you had people changing sides. Right? And you had Protestants in Ireland who supported the king, and you had Protestants in Ireland who supported the Parliament. As I say, it's something that's almost impossible to unravel. But a key episode in that crisis, and in fact, which leads ultimately to the English Civil War, was the Ulster Rebellion of 1641. Now, this was many things, this rebellion, but one of the things that it was an uprising of the dispossessed, those people who had lost their land as a consequence of the plantation. Let's say it really is complicated and there's much more to it, but this is certainly one of the things that it was. And it's very interesting that this was not some sort of blind bloodlust that occurred, because in the early weeks of the uprising, the rebels targeted only the English planters. They left the Scots planters alone. Eventually they turned on the Scots planters as well. Now, there were massacres. It was an horrendous episode. There was a lot of people who were ritually humiliated, a lot of planters who were stripped naked. This was a ritual humiliation. Turned out many people died of exposure in the winter of 1641. This had an extraordinary impact on English Protestant opinion. And an army was raised in England to put down the Irish Rebellion. And that army, the dispute between Parliament and the King was over who would have control of that army. Parliament did not want to give the King control of the army because they did not trust him. They felt that he would use the army against them. They were probably right. And that dispute over the control of the army, that is the actual issue on which the Parliament and the King finally went to war. And so because they were fighting each other, they had to leave Ireland for the time being. But here's a contemporary depiction of 1641. English Protestants stripped naked and turned into the mountains in the frost. And savages, many hundreds are perished to death, and many lying dead in ditches. And savages upbraided them, saying, "Now ye are wild Irish as well as we." So there's a whole ritual and symbolic aspect to this stripping of the planters. Now, as I say, this had a deep, deep impact on English Protestant opinion at the time, but partly for our purposes, because we're talking here about historical roots. This is an Orange Order banner. The Rising Sons of Portadown, district number 273, and what they're depicting on their banner is the massacres in 1641. And here you have the Papists with their pikes and their spears, and here you have the settlers again stripped naked, right? And they've been piked to death. The single most notorious episode in 1641 was Portadown Bridge, and, where a number of planters were thrown off the bridge and drowned. When they tried to come out of the river, they were pegged back into the river. Portadown. This again, so this is something which is indelible in the Protestant loyalist tradition. This is a central image, this notion of Portadown Bridge. There's a story, and apparently this is true, where an Irishman from Portadown, which has sometimes a remarkably ironic name, is the Vatican of Orangeism. But he was in an argument and he said, you know, what had happened in 1641. The guy said, you're exaggerating. He says, no. He says, it happened in that bridge over there. He says, and we have photographs in the lodge to prove it. Which again, kind of underlines my point about historical literacy. That's not these people are not historically literate, but that doesn't mean that the past doesn't influence how they think and how they see the world. Now, this brings us to the second quotation, and that is of Cromwell. You know, if you remember the second quotation I made about Eamon de Valera bringing Lloyd George back, keeps pulling him back to Cromwell. So why Cromwell? And again, we're in the 17th century. Well, I'm sure you've heard of the phrase warts and all, you know, tell the truth, warts and all. This comes from a remark, and this must be the painting, mustn't it? There are several portraits of Cromwell, but this comes from a remark that Cromwell made. He said that he wanted his painting warts and all, and that has to be the painting, doesn't it? The big wart above the eyebrow there. Now, Oliver Cromwell. The Parliament won the war, won both of them. They tried the king, and they executed him. And the Kingdom of England became the English Republic. That done, they could now turn their attention to Ireland and put down the rebellion there. The situation in Ireland was more or less a stalemate. Neither the Protestant forces, the parliamentary forces, the Royalist or Confederate forces, Confederation could win, but they couldn't lose either. And it was a bit like the North of Ireland actually by the 1990s. No one could win that, but no one was going to lose it either. So it was essentially a stalemate in military terms. And the stalemate is broken by Cromwell and by the New Model Army. They arrive at Ringsend in Dublin in August 1649, and Cromwell departs the country in May 1650. But arguably no one has ever had as much impact on the course of Irish history as Cromwell. But that's how long he was in the country, from August 49 to May of 50. Right? Now, he had two tasks in mind, well, three tasks. One was the military problem. He had to put down the rebellion and secure Ireland for the Republic. That is, secure Ireland for the English Republic. Right? That's the first task. Second task was economic. The Republic had a huge bill, and one of the ways in which they had financed the war, one of the ways in which Parliament had financed the war, was through what was called the Adventurers Act. And this was money raised against land in Ireland. In other words, you bought government bonds, you loaned money to the government, and the government said, we will pay you back in land in Ireland. So Cromwell and the New Model Army were now going to Ireland to get that land, right, to give to a new wave of settlers, people who were creditors to the government. Thirdly, and not least, and think of those images. Think of those images and the impact that they had. Vengeance. He was going to exact God's vengeance on the barbarous Irish papists. And as I say, where I come from, this man didn't mess around. The most notorious episode, of course, was the siege of Drogheda, which even broke the rules of war by 17th century standards. When they ended the siege, when they came into the city, they put man, woman, and child to the sword. Now, it's very interesting the way in which Cromwell reports this. Cromwell, during his tour in Ireland, would write back regular and frequent dispatches to the Speaker of the House of Commons, Lenthal, describing and keeping him up to date with what was going on in Ireland. And his letter to Lenthal after Drogheda is very revealing. And what he said, and remember, Cromwell's a godly man, and he believes in God's providence. And when things go right, he believes that this is God's approval. And when things go wrong, he believes that this is God's disapproval. And in fact, when things finally did go wrong for him, which was the English westward enterprise, the English attempt to expel the Spanish from the Barbados, which failed in 1655. When that failed, and Cromwell, had proposed this mission, well, this was a clear sign from God. It was a sign that he had sinned or he had done wrong. He had to interpret this. He had something which would today be called a nervous breakdown when his military forces finally did fail, because up to that point they had an unbroken record. But this is what he says to Lenthal. I am persuaded, he's talking about the massacre at Drogheda, I am persuaded that this is a righteous judgment of God upon these barbarous wretches who have imbrued their hands in so much innocent blood. That's how he describes Drogheda. I'm persuaded that this is a righteous judgment of God upon those barbarous wretches who have imbrued their hands in so much innocent blood. What he's talking about is 1641. Again, Cromwell is no historian. Most of the people who were in Drogheda were actually Old English. That is, they were Catholics of English extraction, and they had nothing to do with 1641. But again, that's rather besides the point. And it's also interesting because as soon as he left Ireland, what did he do? He went up to Scotland and he trounced the Scots. Right? But his attitude is completely different to the Scots. His attitude to the Scots is because they're Presbyterian, is that they're just a bit wrong-headed. And he's doing this more in sorrow than in anger. And he actually he sends a statement to the Synod, or the General Assembly of the Scottish Kirk, Presbyterian Church, and he says, this is before they go into Scotland, and he says, in the bowels of Christ, I beseech you, think that you might be mistaken. He doesn't send any such message to Drogheda. Think that you might be mistaken. He's kind of offering them an opportunity to negotiate. But it also shows you, for all his undoubted talents, how incredibly thick he must have been. The notion that he could imagine that a 17th century Scots Presbyterian could ever think that he was mistaken. Because one thing that Scots Presbyterians never were was mistaken. And but the figure of Cromwell, there's two things before we move on. The Cromwellian episode leads to a further confiscation, huge confiscations of land. The native Irish are pushed back behind the River Shannon into Connacht, again the poorest of poor land in the country, and County Clare. The phrase was to hell or Connacht. Many actually are dispatched to the Barbados as indentured servants or slaves. And basically the remaining Catholic landed class is stripped of its land. It's almost eliminated as a political elite in the 1650s. It's been estimated that Catholic land ownership by 1659 had gone down to 9%. So Cromwell more or less completes, or the Cromwellians, more or less completes the process which had begun in the 16th century and which had been accelerated by the plantation of Ulster. It is reversed somewhat, but this is a major and enduring shift in the distribution of land and power in Ireland under Cromwell. Now, just to bring you forward the present again and the way in which history shapes these things, I was astonished some years ago I read this interview with the leader of the Scottish Nationalist Party, Alex Salmon, and it was one of these questions, what's your favourite colour? It was that sort of quiz, or interview, what's your favourite colour, who's your favourite Spice Girl? And I think it was Ginger Spice was his answer. But who's your hero? This is the leader of the Scottish Nationalist Party. He says Oliver Cromwell. Right? Now, Cromwell defeated the Scots at Dunbar and at Worcester. The Scots weren't treated as badly as the Irish, but they weren't well treated. So how can he say this? And I know what he's talking about. He was a modernising force in Scotland and in Ireland. In some ways he was a reformer, but it's just unimaginable an Irish politician or an Irish person giving that answer. Right? So the way that Cromwell's memory resonates in Ireland is completely different from how it resonates in England and how it resonates in Scotland. It's an interesting case. So there's actually a book, I've talked about this in the past, but there's a book came out last year called Cromwell's Head. Yeah? Now, it's actually quite instructive. Cromwell died in 1658 and he received a huge state funeral. But the Republic unravelled, or a protectorate it was called, and it collapsed. And the King, Charles II, was restored in 1660. Now, one of the first things that they did was everyone was pardoned. I mean, it was such a mess that had occurred. There was no point in punishing. People just would have destroyed the country. So there was a general pardon issued for whatever side you'd taken on a civil war, except for regicides, that is, people who had actually signed the document which had brought Charles's father to the scaffold. And so people who were identified as regicides were to be executed. And even that stopped after a while. I think they executed 13 or something of them, and then they called a halt. But not even the dead were to escape from this. And Ayrton Bradshaw, who was the judge, Ayrton was Cromwell's son-in-law, and Cromwell were all dug up, right? And they were hanged, drawn, and quartered, right? And so Cromwell's head was then, the skull, was then placed on a spike in Westminster Abbey, where it remained until 1688, which was the year of the Revolution and the Great Protestant Deliverance. And in November, just basically as King Billy, William of Orange, was making his way to London, there was a thunderstorm, and Cromwell's head was blown off the spike and disappeared. And it showed up later. There's a whole book about this now, as I said. It showed up later, and it was basically in a cabinet of curios. It was put on display in Victorian England, and has a long, complicated history. And eventually, the head came to rest, as it were, after being kicked around the country for 300 years, in Sidney Sussex College in Cambridge, which was his college. And the college accepted the skull in 1963. Now, they interred it in a small private ceremony. Only 2 people in the world know where Cromwell's head is, right? That is the master of Sidney Sussex College, and I think it's the bursar. Maybe the dean knows as well. 2 or 3 people. And so if any of you have a very distinguished academic career and find yourself as the master or mistress of Sidney Sussex College, you'll find out where Cromwell's head is. Now, Um, Two little things. There's a portrait of Cromwell in that college in the dining hall. And if you go into that dining hall and look, it has a rail above it with curtains. It's the only portrait where this is the case. And the story behind that was that Princess Margaret used to dine sometimes. Whoever was a master in the 1960s was a friend of hers, and sometimes she would come to college to dine. And they'd pull a curtain across the portrait of Cromwell because he was a regicide, a kinkle. It was just bad manners, to have a member of the current royal family. And so this would be covered up. Now, so you've Alex Salmon saying Cromwell's his hero. There's a statue of Cromwell outside Westminster. Lord Rosebery, the Prime Minister who put that statue up, this is amazing. This is astonishing. He thought that he would get the support of Redmond and the Irish Party to fund this statue. He was dependent on the votes of, Parnell was gone by that time, of the Irish Home Rule Party, and was kind of surprised when they said, no, we're not voting for this. I mean, this is his total misreading of Irish attitudes to the past. But before I leave Cromwell, I'll give you a little personal connection with this. Was when I was a graduate student at Cambridge, some wag, I think I know who it was, he's not a rather significant public intellectual, but he was a graduate student at the time who put this story out. And I was talking to a graduate student, and she said to me, oh, I know who you are. I said, what do you mean? She said, you're the Irish guy who has been sent over to retrieve Cromwell's head. That's a brilliant image, like if I'd actually pulled this off, gone down O'Connell Street on a double-decker bus, open to waving Cromwell's head to the cheering masses. Now, as I say, I'm only picking out episodes in the 17th century because obviously, given the constraints of time, it wouldn't make any sense to try and talk about the century as a whole. But it's punctuated by these great transformative moments. The plantation at the beginning, the Cromwellian confiscations in the middle, and then the crisis of the Williamite or Jacobite wars from 1688 to 1691. Now, what brought this crisis about was the accession to the throne of a Catholic, James II, in 1685. This was a major constitutional and political crisis for Protestants in Scotland, Ireland, and England. Because Catholicism, to them, popery, as they called it, meant tyranny. It meant that their liberties and their religion would be stripped from them. What had happened the last time that a Catholic had been on the throne, and that was the 1550s, what had happened? Protestants had been burned at the stake. Right? The fires of Smithfield in London, Protestants had been burnt as heretics. I don't think that they thought that James was going to start, stoking up the fires again at Smithfield Market, but they didn't think things were going to go well. Now, this led, the crisis actually, they were kind of gritting their teeth and bearing this. What changed everything was on the 10th of June, 1688, the Queen had a son. What this meant was, up until that point, when James, who was no longer a chicken, died, he would be succeeded by one of his daughters, Anne or Mary, who were Protestants. So the view was, okay, we don't like this, but we can sit it out. Once a son is born to James, that all changes, because what they're now looking into is the prospect of a Catholic dynasty stretching beyond where the eye can see. This is the proverbial straw. The members of the English political elite dispatch representatives to the Netherlands, to William of Orange. And the reason they go turn to William, King Billy, is he's married to Mary Stuart, that is James's daughter. So this gives him a fig leaf of legitimacy, right? Think about what we do. I mean, here's a pop quiz. Someone here, and I'm so confident. I mean, I'll give $1,000 to someone here. I'm going to regret this. Give me the name of the wife of George the First. George the Second, George the Third, George the Fourth. Okay. Well, who's the wife of William? Mary. William and Mary. They go together, right? How come? And the reason is because Mary is the person who gives this monarchy legitimacy, because she's the daughter, whereas William, what's his right? The Dutch stadtholder. So this is why they emphasise the Mary in that at that moment, and this is why he's called in. And he's the Protestant champion. So, William lands in the south of England on the 4th of November, 1688, and starts making his way towards London. This is called the Bloodless Revolution in the English tradition, because it is actually carried off almost without a drop of blood in England. Not in Scotland, not in Ireland, right, but in England. And one of the reasons this happens is John Churchill, the same Churchill family. This is direct ancestor of Winston Churchill. I quoted at the beginning, future Duke of Marlborough. John Churchill was in charge of the troops defending London for the king, and as William approached, he just went over to the other side. Right? And the defence of London collapsed, and William's forces entered, and James fled. Thereby hangs the tale. James, rather sad figure at this point. For a law to pass in the English system, it has to go through the House of Commons, it has to go through the House of Lords, and then it has to receive the royal assent. And a law does not become law until it receives the royal assent, and it doesn't receive the royal assent until it's stamped with the royal seal. That is, that big blob of red wax, and there's a stamp on that with the royal seal. Only at that moment does something become law. Now, all that James could do at this point was he thought he would gum up the system, and he threw the royal seal into the River Thames as he fled London. And the British, famous for their innovation and ingenuity, made another seal, and business continued. But what happens to James is he's recognised at Dover by these good Protestant, loyal English subjects, and he's arrested. And he's trying to make his way to France. And so he's brought back to London, and he's placed in the Tower. This was the last thing that William and the elites wanted. Because what were they going to do with him? Right? They wanted to see the back of him. They didn't want him in custody because this really complicated matters. And they certainly weren't going to execute him. That would be, there'd already been a king executed that century. I mean, 2 executions would be rather bad manners. And so what happened was he escaped. He escaped from the Tower. And how he escaped basically was the door was left open, and the turnkey said, "Hey Joe, I'm going down to the pub. Will you come and join me?" And they left the door swinging. And so James escaped and made his way to France. From France, he then makes his way to Ireland. Now, that's why it's not a bloodless revolution, because the resistance to the revolution, to William, comes in Scotland, first in Scotland and then in Ireland. And again, bringing us back to the historical conditioning of these things, a key episode in these wars was the Siege of Derry. John, have I got that the right way around?
Got it right, yeah.
And these are Derry's walls. I think I'm right in saying they're the only intact walls left in Europe. And I'll talk about the siege in a moment, but here are the apprentice boys, and commencing one of their annual parades. The point here about the historical conditioning of the Troubles is people take various dates for the beginning of the Troubles. One would be October 5th, 1968 at Duke Street in Derry. But another one, standard one, is the 12th of August, 1969. And this is when a riot begins in the Bogside in Derry, which escalates into what later mythologized as the Battle of the Bogside, which spreads to Belfast and beyond, which leads eventually by the 14th of August with the introduction of British troops. It's the collapse of the Northern Ireland state, in effect, happens over those few days. And British troops are introduced onto the streets. By the 14th of August, 15th of August, they arrive in Belfast. Now, what sparked that off? Well, it was a march by the apprentice boys, which was commemorating the siege of Derry. And so here you again have this direct historic linkage. And this has always been taken as a provocation, the route of the march by the Catholics in the Bogside. And so it was an attack on the march, the police attack the Bogsiders. You have kind of essentially a police riot which gets out of control. But again, it's this moment of historical commemoration, which dates back to the 17th century, which marks the beginning of the Troubles. Now, what happened in Derry was that the Bishop Hopkins, I think was his name, Bishop Hopkins, he was arguing that the city should surrender to the Jacobite forces of James, because James was still the rightful king. And this debate sort of was going on in the city. And a number of butchers' apprentices unilaterally shut the gates, right? They shut the gates of the city against the Jacobite forces, and thus began the siege. Right? And this is part of the so-called siege mentality. This is a great moment in Ulster Protestant mythology. Now, I think it was the governor of the city, a man called Lundy, deserted during the siege to the Jacobite forces, and he's burned in effigy every year. Right, Lundy is. Now, again, in terms of historical literateness, it would be probably rather interesting, to ask the people who are burning Lundy in effigy who he was and what he did. And I suspect you may get some entertaining answers. But nonetheless, this is a tradition which has been transmitted from this era. Now, the siege of Derry is important, not only in sort of symbolic terms, but it was genuinely important in military terms. Because what it did was it tied up the Jacobite forces, while the Williamite forces were able to mobilise and to build up their resources in England. The idea had been that once Ireland was secured, that the Jacobite forces would invade Scotland, and from Scotland they moved down to London. So Ireland was going to be a launching pad. In fact, what actually happened, because of Derry, was the reverse. The Jacobite forces were battled up at this siege, and the Williamites made their way from Scotland over to Carrickfergus and into Ireland. And the key battle, of course, which is commemorated in every gable wall in the Protestant north of Ireland, was the Battle of the Boyne on the 12th of July, 1st of July old style, 1690. Thus the injunction, remember 1690. Right? And what's been remembered here, of course, is the victory of the Williamite forces over the Jacobite forces. Now, this was an episode in European history, an important episode in European history. On the Williamite side, there were Dutchmen and Danes, Scots and English and Irish Protestants. On the Jacobite side, there were Irish Catholics, but there were also French. And the French were fighting the Dutch here. And the victory of William was celebrated with the ringing of bells in Rome. Okay. So it's one of the great historical ironies that the Pope celebrated the victory of King Billy. Now, because this was an episode in a European war, and the Pope was allied with the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Austria, against the forces of France. So it was the victory of the anti-French coalition. In Ireland, it's seen as, with justification, as a victory of the Protestants over the Catholics. There's an even bloodier battle to the day, a year later, at Aughrim in Galway, which is the largest single battle ever held on Irish soil. 7,000 people were killed in one day at Aughrim. And the Jacobite forces retreat to Limerick, the second siege of the war, and the Jacobite forces surrender under Sarsfield, surrender at Limerick in October 1691. They sign the treaty, or the Articles of Limerick, the military and civil articles. The military articles are adhered to, and you get the flight of the wild geese at the end of the century. Irish Jacobite forces should go off in the service of France. The civil articles, which basically guarantee toleration for Catholics, are not honoured. Now, this was not bad faith on William's part. This was a treaty which had been signed in the field by two generals. It required statutory force, that is, it had to be passed in Parliament. The King could not do that. And when it actually came before the Parliament in Dublin, the Irish Protestant Parliament refused to ratify the Treaty of Limerick. The significance of Limerick in 1691 is that this opens the era of Protestant ascendancy. And the 18th century is the Protestant century in Ireland par excellence. It's one of complete dominance of the settler class up until at least the last quarter of the century. And the story of the late 18th century, the 19th century, into the 20th century is the story of the unraveling and the pushing back of the land transfers, the confiscations, the forfeitures that had occurred in the 17th century. And they're eventually rolled back through much of the country. The final piece of legislation will be the Wyndham Act of 1903. The place, of course, where they have not been rolled back is Ulster. The land which changed hands in the plantation has remained in the descendants of those planters. So in effect, I mean, one of the ways in which you can conceptualize Irish history is that you get the reversal of the 17th century settlements. You get the reversal of those settlements through the course of the 19th into the 20th century. The place where it's not reversed is the north. Right? And because it hasn't been reversed, you have a structural problem. Right? And that structural problem, to say, is directly put back your watch 400 years. Right? So that structural problem persists. Right? I'm not sure it can be rectified as such without something akin to ethnic cleansing. Right? But that structure remains in place. Therefore, you have partition. You have people with a different sense of national identity and allegiance, which persists. And people, from another standpoint, people have a sense of unfinished business. And this has not been resolved. And so in that sense, though I said history is not destiny, people are not locked in, but there is a sense in which in the north people are locked in by certain circumstances and conditions which have to be addressed. Some people think some ways cannot be addressed or resolved. And in that sense, the troubles you can see, and this is I suppose quite pessimistic conclusion, are in a very direct and obvious ways resulting from a burden of history. However, I would not end on a pessimistic note. The best example, I think, of that view of history, and of a view of history, and also which is deeply patterned, deeply structured, deeply repetitive, and is a book which came out in 1977 by an also Unionist historian, A.T.Q. Stewart, called The Narrow Ground. Right? It's a marvelous book in many ways, beautifully written, but it's deeply pessimistic. Right? And he basically, and it's like Churchill. What Churchill said, as the floods subside, the dreary steeples of Fermanagh and Tyrone, the integrity of their struggle intact. This is just going to go on forever. I think what we saw in the 1990s actually demonstrates that it is possible, that politics can defeat history. And the situation that we have at present is far from flawless. It's deeply imperfect. There are all sorts of issues about sectarianism and so forth, the institutionalizing of. But this is a long, long way from where we were at the beginning of the 1990s. And what it does represent in one way is the triumph of politics. The triumph of politics over history. But none of this, as I say, can be explained. And if we get back on that plane and we put back our watches 400 years. Okay, so I've deliberately left 5 or 10 minutes to take questions.
Questions?
Go ahead.
I'll bring the mic.
You mentioned that in Ulster, the land was not reverted back to Catholic rule as it had been in the rest of Ireland. I was wondering if you could elaborate on as to why that was.
Well, the reason is because there were plantations in Ireland before Ulster, for one thing, but the basic difference between the Ulster plantation and settlement in Ulster was that there were more boots on the ground. That is, there were more Scots and English who actually came and settled in Ulster. What tended to happen, and this happened with the Cromwellians, was that the land went to Protestant landlords. So what you had in the south was a landlord class, right, with the Catholic tenants. It's a different structure. Whereas you had small farmers and middle-sized farmers in places like North Armagh who were Protestant, right? The only place outside of Ulster where that was true was South Wicklow and North Wexford was the only place where you had a sizable, and I suppose to a certain extent Cork, where you had sizable Protestant presence, right? So what that meant was, and it was easier to reverse because not all, but what you needed to do was to expropriate, or as it happened, buy out the landlords. This is what the land war was about, and there were various things like freedom of sale and fixed duty of tenure and so on, fair rents. But eventually what it was about was buying out the landlord class. And I mentioned the Wyndham Act of 1903, and that essentially loaned money to the tenant class in Ireland from the government to buy out the landlords, and they were bought out. There's a famous story, not a famous, but a well-known story about Lord Wyndham, the man who the act is named after, was going through a casino in Monte Carlo in about 1910 or something, and there was an Irish landlord there, at the tables, and he just shouted over him, "Thanks very much, George," and he was gambling with basically the British government money, which had bought him out of the land. So you couldn't do that in the north, because it was more densely settled by Scots than by the English. That was the difference. Does that explain? Does that explain you?
Jim, I think one of our problems maybe is that I'm just thinking about history and the fact that it's become so important to us and right through the island of Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was in the Playboy, the Western World, the line was actually used. That history is the nightmare from which we should awake.
No, it's Joyce.
It's James Joyce.
Yep.
But the thing I was thinking about was the influence, particularly of with James's arrival back in Ireland at Kinsale,
Mm-hmm.
and immediately the Protestant, the Protestants in the very south of Ireland, hark back almost immediately to 1641.
Yes.
That's the drive that makes them go north, particularly in the counties closest to Derry.
Yes.
And that drives a population of a city from 3,000 up to over 20,000.
Yep.
The fear in that. And I think there's that thing about history, but there also is the thing that's become very important to me recently, was that they had a dirty tricks department back then too.
Mm-hmm.
And the Cumber letter.
Oh yeah, the Cumber letter. Let me explain what this is. It was the letter Cumber.
I think I'll let you explain that.
It was a letter when James arrived in Ireland. There was a letter which was found, right, called the Cumber letter, and it was allegedly a letter from one of the Jacobite forces to another one saying that they were going to massacre the Protestants. And of course, this was recent memory for them, 1641, and this Cumber letter sparked a panic that what was going to happen under James was that there was going to be another 1641. And this is, as John rightly says, this is why they fled to the walled cities of Enniskillen and Derry, because they were running literally in fear of their lives, that what had happened in 1641 was going to happen again. And it was that sense, that historic sense, right? And Derry then adds to it because people famously talk about the Ulster Protestants having a siege mentality. And literally this begins with this siege, And if you think of their slogans, what are they? No surrender, not an inch. What we have, we hold. I mean, these are not very progressive or forward-looking slogans, but they're deep in the mentality. And of course, there's the speed. When the Anglo-Irish Agreement was made in 1985, the speed with which they came up with the slogan to reject it, which was what Ulster says no, right? That was and a huge big banner across the Belfast City Hall. Ulster says no, but I mean the north of Ireland's there's a lovely black humour in the north of Ireland, and the speed with which another one came up, right? Yes, and there was an advertisement at the time for Del Monte orange juice, right? And the peons are out, growing oranges, picking oranges, whatever you do with oranges, and in orange groves, right? And the man from Del Monte, who's this white linen suit with a Panama hat, flies in this helicopter, you see, and he walks over to the orange grove, and all the peons freeze, and they're looking at him, and he picks up an orange and he squeezes it, and picks up another orange and squeezes it, and he's talking to the ganger, and the next thing he walks off and he turns around and he speaks to one of the peons, and he turns around and he shouts, "The man from Del Monte says yes," right? In other words, the man from Del Monte has approved the oranges, you see? And so the Anglo-Irish Agreement was introduced, let's say, on the 5th of November. On the 6th of November, the Loyalists had come up with this slogan, Ulster says no. On the 7th of November, there was a slogan up on the Falls Road, Ulster says no, but the man from Del Monte says yes.
I think just an add-on to that, Jim, literally that slogan, that line that says history is the nightmare from which we are trying to awake.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the time we set the alarm clock.
Yeah, indeed. To move from watches to alarm clocks, it's all very postmodern.
Another question? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Professor Smith.
Thank you. Here's your wee.
All right, folks. We'll take a break here, and we'll come